Just outside of Millbank, South Dakota, on a small family farm, Sarah and Mark Erickson have been up for hours working on land that's been passed down to them by Sarah's father, Clayton Tuholke. Clayton comes from a proud family of farmers. He and his wife Denise loved their land.
It was my dream come true. He gave me my dream when we got married and could live on a acreage away from town.
Careful, the cup is hot.
They planned to live there for many years, but then one day they begin to notice Clayton's tremors.
Shaking the hands, right, first thing most people notice.
We both noticed it in church because the bulletin would shake.
This uncontrollable shaking got progressively worse, prompting them to go see a doctor.
His regular doctor suggested a neurologist, so then that's when he was diagnosed.
Clayton's diagnosis was Parkinson's disease, a central nervous system disorder which there's no known cure. Clayton's life is now devoted to doing all that he can to stall the symptoms.
And we're done. Whew.
This man was so independent. We both had our own careers, and his independence has been taken from him, which is unfair.
What's worse, Clayton believes he got Parkinson's disease from using an herbicide called Paraquat on his farm for a number of years.
Nobody ever thought he was spraying something that would hurt anybody.
Yeah, you didn't know spray was going to affect your health.
Paraquat is so poisonous that it needs a license to be used. The EPA warns that one small sip can kill with no known antidote. During training, you're told to wear the proper protective equipment, including respirators, when handling it. It's sprayed widely across the United States and some other parts of the world because of how effective it is at killing weeds, even the weeds that have developed resistance to other herbicides.
You don't want it to drift to crops. You have to be careful where you spray.
Even as there's widespread agreement about its toxicity, for years, some of the world's leading scientists have also published studies saying that pesticides like Paraquat can also lead to an elevated risk of developing Parkinson's. It's part of the reason why Clayton and his family are now suing the two companies that he believes knew or should have known that Paraquat could cause severe neurological injuries. He's one of more than 4,000 people, many of them farmers, who have filed lawsuits in a multi-district litigation against the manufacturer, a company called Syngenta, that has sold at least $1 billion worth of Paraquat, as well as Chevron, which distributed Paraquat exclusively in the U.S. from 1966 until 1986 when they stopped selling it here, but Syngenta continued.
Anytime chemicals applied to the fields that they have to use, they should know what's going to happen. All the generations that are coming up afterwards need to know.
The plaintiffs say there's a lot of science to back their claims, while Syngenta says that scientific evidence simply does not support a causal link between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease. They say that as long as farmers follow the label, take the proper precautionary measures, and get the right training, Paraquat is safe to use.
We consider that used carefully and appropriately, that it is safe for operators.
But some of the nation's top scientists remain concerned.
We saw things that were convincing to us that Paraquat could indeed be a risk factor for Parkinson's disease.
Dr. Deborah Corey-Schlechter has done extensive studies on how environmental toxins, including Paraquat, affect the brains of mice. Her research is frequently cited as evidence suggesting a link between Paraquat and Parkinson's.
We found a loss of dopamine neurons in the substantia nigra, which is what is seen in human Parkinson's disease. Since then, other people have gone on and showed very similar kinds of effects.
Syngenta currently sells Paraquat in 5 countries: the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Indonesia. At least 51 other countries have banned it. Many cite its extreme toxicity as the reason for the ban, while countries like Brazil and members of the European Union also express concern over the possible risk for Parkinson's disease. Peter Flowers is one of the attorneys suing Syngenta.
Syngenta's marketing about helping farmers as the core of its business is a joke. Syngenta's marketing is for Syngenta its shareholders. It's not for helping farmers, because this isn't helping farmers, this is hurting farmers.
In fact, the two countries where the product is produced, the UK and China, have banned its domestic use. Even as a state-owned Chinese chemical company acquired Syngenta in a record $43 billion deal in 2017, touted in this video.
The fact that the Chinese government essentially owns Syngenta, but doesn't use it in their own country, but they continue to sell it here, that's ridiculous. We as Americans should be outraged by this.
Part of the outrage, Flowers claims, is that both companies did not reveal critical information about Paraquat to its users, including questions some of their own scientists and executives were aware of for decades.
There has been smoke about Paraquat causing Parkinson's disease since the late 80s and 90s. And that also is driven somewhat by what Syngenta internally knows or doesn't know and discloses to the scientific community.
Some of this came to light in a 2017 lawsuit after multiple people with Parkinson's sued Syngenta and Chevron, which Syngenta settled for more than $187 million for claims they say have no merit. Carrie Gillum is the managing editor for The New Lead, an environmental news website supported by the Environmental Working Group, and a contributing reporter for The Guardian. She's done groundbreaking reports on the possible dangers of Roundup, an herbicide made by the chemical giant Monsanto. She says that one day, a box of Chevron and Syngenta's internal documents showed up at her home out of the blue.
At what point did you realize what you were thumbing through?
Well, immediately. The documents that showed up on my doorstep include memos, scientific studies, just a real treasure trove of internal information from Chevron and Syngenta.
You were looking at internal memos that raised red flags decades ago.
Decades ago.
As early as 1974, in the document, Chevron executives are aware that state officials are expressing concerns about Paraquat's possible long-term chronic effects on workers. What continuous exposure can do to workers is a question they say they are unable to properly respond to at this time. In a meeting, they decide to add warnings to their label, in part because a lawyer believes that there is evidence that Paraquat could cause industrial injury and that Chevron could face suits totaling millions of dollars. Specific instructions on protective clothing, the lawyer argues, can provide a good basis to resist lawsuits.
They were talking about the chronic effects possibly causing them legal problems back in the 1970s.
The company agrees to add language advising users to wear goggles and an approved mask or respirator capable of filtering spray mist if there was a risk of accidental exposure. But plaintiffs say that Paraquat's products were still not accompanied by proper warnings regarding its possible health effects, including developing Parkinson's disease as a result of exposure.
If we knew what we know now, we'd have never used it. But we didn't know the side effects, the after effect of it.
Frank Garcia and his wife Maria began spraying Paraquat on their small family farm in Arizona. Paraquat had just been restricted, and Frank says he got certified to use it.
You had to take that class to get a number in order to buy it. So that was about it. If you've ever been to a government class, I'll just leave it at that.
Mom, you ready for your drops?
Frank's wife Maria now has Parkinson's disease. She relies on her entire family for around-the-clock care. Frank says that it was never made clear to him that there were questions about Paraquat's possible long-term effects. He doesn't remember if he and Maria wore respirators while applying it.
Well, we knew it was toxic if you drank it. It says do not swallow. They said be careful around, don't wash your hands, and so that was about it.
Push up those legs.
While the Garcias used Paraquat for a number of years, in 1985, a Chevron internal memo flagged a big concern, an article about how pesticides, including Paraquat, may be implicated as a cause for Parkinson's disease. We can hope that another chemical or cause will explain the correlation, the memo says, and that I trust Chevron is watching this closely and perhaps doing a little testing for the sake of its customers and stockholders.
They talked about potentially having a legacy of a Paraquat Parkinson's disease, much like asbestos was a legacy problem for another company.
But they actually compared it to asbestos.
They did.
The next year, Chevron stopped selling Paraquat completely. Chevron telling ABC News that they regularly reviewed studies regarding the safety of Paraquat, and none of them showed a causal link. They say they stopped selling Paraquat for commercial reasons and not because of health concerns. Meanwhile, Syngenta continued selling Paraquat, a 1985 internal memo to management saying they depended on it as a major product and would do whatever possible to defend it.
So they wanted to develop sort of a counter attack, a counter strategy. They talk about developing scientific studies that they can use in their defense of Paraquat. They talk about, influencing strategies with regulators.
Gillum says that strategy could be seen when the EPA was considering Dr. Deborah Corey-Schlechter, whose research found a possible link between Paraquat and Parkinson's disease, for a scientific advisory panel on pesticides in 2005, with internal Syngenta emails showing that they did not want to have her on the panel and asking what action can be taken. They don't want her there because, they wrote, they believe that she's unwilling to enter into objective scientific debate with industry regarding her data, a position they told us they continue to stand by.
So you can see through the emails how they developed this plan that they want to convince the EPA to kick her off or to not appoint her.
I'm not surprised. It's consistent with typical operations that they might undertake to prevent somebody from being on a committee that would make decisions with respect to their chemical.
Coming up, with so many questions and so much controversy, why does the EPA continue to allow Paraquat to be used?
You feel like it's a conflict?
It certainly seems to be a conflict.
And why the Michael J. Fox Foundation is stepping in to join the fight.
The Michael J. Fox Foundation came to us with questions. They wanted to know why this chemical was still being approved and used in the United States.
In this moment,
and the winner is Michael J. Fox, Winslow.
Winning a Golden Globe for the Best Actor in Comedy, Michael J. Fox looked like he was on top of the world.
Suffice to say, I was not expecting this.
But what the rest of the world didn't know was that Michael was hiding a big secret. 7 years earlier, at 29 years old, Michael had been diagnosed with early onset Parkinson's disease.
The 60s are over, Dad.
It was a shocking twist to the story of an actor who had first captured our hearts as Alex P. Keaton on Family Ties.
Hi. Sorry I had to answer the door myself. Our butler's off tonight.
Then as Marty McFly in the Back to the Future trilogy.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
He was at the top of his career, making this reveal all the more shocking.
I had hidden my symptoms and struggles very well. The time for quietly soldiering on is through. The war against Parkinson's is a winnable war, and I have resolved to play a role in that victory.
Since then, Michael has helped found the Michael J. Fox Foundation, an organization dedicated to research around Parkinson's, of which 90,000 people in the U.S. are diagnosed every year. Fox has never blamed Paraquat for his disease, but his organization has frequently been outspoken about environmental factors they believe may have increased the risk of Parkinson's, including Paraquat. They're now represented by Earth Justice, an environmental law firm. In a lawsuit they filed against the EPA, suing them for the decision to allow the continued use of Paraquat in the U.S.
EPA's assumption that existing regulations would be sufficient to protect people is just not grounded in reality and not supported by science.
Part of the EPA's role is to help regulate the use of pesticides. But the EPA has long been accused of having too close ties with the very industry they're supposed to monitor, with one study finding that the EPA approved pesticide products at a rate of 94% between 2017 and 2018.
The charitable way to explain it is that they've had a hard time keeping up with the tens of thousands of chemicals that have been rolled out, in the last several decades. And they struggle, I think, to keep up with things.
The EPA told ABC that their process for pesticide registration is widely considered the most sophisticated and scientifically robust in the world. In deciding to reapprove Paraquat's use in the U.S., they pointed to a 2020 study sponsored in part by the National Institute of Health. They say it found no evidence of an association between Paraquat exposure and Parkinson's disease.
Contrary to dozens of countries which have found that Paraquat is too dangerous to continue using, the United States Environmental Protection Agency reached the exact opposite conclusion. And I think that in doing so, EPA made a number of just flawed decisions.
That's, said to be by many. There's a very cozy relationship between these large companies and the EPA, and you see a bit of a revolving door. You see people going back and forth between industry and the EPA.
You feel like it's a conflict?
It certainly seems to be a conflict.
The EPA said there was no improper influence from the pesticide industry over the Paraquat interim decision. They said that their employees meet and exceed federal ethical requirements to ensure that all decisions are made impartially with no improper influence.
You have this vast disconnect where you have an agency that was set up to protect public health, and yet time and time again you see the approval of pesticides that just leave farm workers and agricultural communities and others facing severe risks.
Syngenta told ABC News that despite decades of investigation, no scientist or doctor has ever concluded in a peer-reviewed publication that Paraquat causes Parkinson's. But many in the scientific community believe there is consensus that there is an association.
I think the data is almost can be described as overwhelming. There are a number of human epidemiological studies that have found these associations. They come from different countries, different cohorts, which gives them further credibility. The animal data is equally strong and supportive.
Syngenta is doing its best to try and forestall domestic regulation by highlighting uncertainties or by trying to question the science. And I think that here, if you look at the entire body of evidence, there's really only one conclusion that can be reached.
The EPA announced last year that it would reconsider its decision. It told ABC News that it could not comment on ongoing litigation.
Now EPA has a chance to go back to fix the mistakes that it made during the prior risk evaluation, to reject Syngenta's interference, and to provide the protections that the law requires. And we're waiting to see whether EPA lives up to that.
Did you and Dad dance every dance? I remember you saying that you would dance almost every dance. Or how does it make you feel that you can't do that anymore?
Well, it makes me a little sad. That, like instead of being able to be dancing out there, I have to be sitting around just watching them.
For the families of loved ones living with Parkinson's disease, any risk is simply not worth it. They just have one message.
That they should have told us the consequences, and they didn't. And that just burns me to a crisp.